A woman pulled over. A false charge. A system designed to break her. Lena Carter thought it was just another morning, until flashing lights in her rearview mirror turned her life upside down. A routine stop? No, a setup. But they picked the wrong person. What starts as a single moment of injustice spirals into something far bigger. A fight that reaches the highest levels of power. Corrupt cops, rigged courts, a prosecutor with a hidden agenda. Lena is up against an entire system built to silence people like her. But she won't stay silent. Before this battle is over, careers will fall, secrets will come to light, and those who thought they were untouchable will learn just how wrong they were. So now, the question isn't whether Lena will win. It's how far she'll go to do it. Comment below, what would you do in her place? Hit like if you love stories of power, corruption, and justice. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Lena Carter had always believed in the law. It was flawed. Yes, she knew that better than most, but it was supposed to stand for something. It was supposed to protect people. Yet, as the red and blue lights flooded her rearview mirror, casting harsh reflections against the glass, a deep sense of dread curled inside her stomach. She checked the speedometer. 32 in a 30 zone. She hadn't swerved, hadn't run a light. There was no reason for this stop. And yet, she already knew what was coming. Taking a slow breath, she flipped on her turn signal and eased her car to the curb. Her hands remained in clear view on the steering wheel, a silent, instinctive precaution. In her side mirror, she saw them step out of patrol car. 2 officers, one tall and muscular, the other stockier with a thick neck and a permanent sneer. They walked toward her with deliberate, unhurried strides, like predators approaching prey. Lena swallowed, steadying herself as she rolled down the window. "Good morning, officers," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "Is there a reason I was stopped?" The taller cop, Simmons, ignored her question entirely. Instead, he held out his hand. "License and registration." Lena complied without hesitation, moving slowly, deliberately. No sudden movements. No reason to escalate. Simmons took the documents and studied them, his expression unreadable. Meanwhile, the other officer, Grant, leaned forward, resting a hand on the edge of her window. "You live around here?" Lena resisted the urge to sigh. "That's not relevant, officer." Grant let out a low whistle. "We got a mouthy one." Lena forced herself to stay calm. She knew this game. They wanted a reaction. Simmons handed back her ID. "Step out of the vehicle." Her grip tightened on the steering wheel. "May I ask why?" His eyes glinted with something unreadable. "Step out." Every fiber of her being screamed at her to demand an explanation, to refuse until they stated probable cause. But one look at Grant's smirk told her everything she needed to know. They were looking for an excuse. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. The second her feet hit the pavement, Simmons grabbed her wrist and yanked her forward. Her body slammed against the side of her car. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. "Hey," she gasped. "What the hell?" "Stop resisting," Grant cut in. "I'm not resisting." She snapped, twisting her neck to look at them. Simmons' grip tightened. "You want to make this hard, sweetheart?" Lena's heart pounded. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, murmurs of concern rippling through them. She spotted a few raised phones, cameras recording. "Good. Let them see this." Grant leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. "You think someone's going to save you?" he murmured. And that's when Lena made her first mistake. She smiled. It was slight, barely a flicker, but Grant saw it. "You have no idea who I am," she said softly. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his expression. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by something darker. He pressed her harder against the car. "Oh, I think I do," he sneered. "Just another nobody who doesn't know her place." Lena forced herself to remain calm, but inside, a fire burned. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It never was. Simmons pulled back slightly, then barked, "You're being detained for obstruction of justice." Her pulse spiked. "Obstruction? That's ridiculous," she said. "I haven't obstructed anything." "I complied." Grant cut her off. "You questioned an officer's authority." That's obstruction. Lena's stomach turned. They were making up as they went, fabricating charges in real time. You can't. Simmons pulled out his handcuffs. Lena's heart pounded. You don't have cause for an arrest. Grant smirked. Sure we do. The cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. And just like that, it was done. A woman in the crowd gasped. Somewhere a child asked, Mommy, what's happening? Lena forced herself to breathe. This was not the time for anger. Not yet. But Simmons and Grant didn't know something. They thought she was just another helpless woman. They thought they were untouchable. They thought this was the end. They had no idea it was just the beginning. Lena Carter had seen injustice before. She had read about it, studied it, even argued against it in courtroom debates. But experiencing it firsthand, feeling the cold steel of handcuffs bite into her wrists, while two smirking officers dragged her toward their squad car, was something else entirely. The crowd on the sidewalk murmured, restless. A few people still had their phones out, capturing the moment. Would it make a difference? Would a shaky cell phone video be enough to stop what was already in motion? Lena doubted it. Simmons shoved her into the back seat. The car smelled of sweat and stale coffee, the fabric rough beneath her fingertips, as she tried to adjust her posture with her hands pinned behind her. Grant slid into the passenger seat, twisting around to smirk at her. Hope you're comfortable back there, he said. Lena met his eyes through the partition. You realize this is an unlawful arrest. Grant feigned surprise. Oh, is that what you think? It's what I know, she said, voice steady. You have no probable cause. I complied with every order you gave. This is profiling, harassment, and false imprisonment. Simmons let out a low chuckle as he pulled the car onto the road. She talks fancy, doesn't she? Grant shrugged. Yeah, they always do. Until they realize none of it matters. Lena's jaw clenched. They always do. There was no need to ask who they meant. Simmons adjusted the rearview mirror, locking eyes with her. Here's how this is going to go. You're going to be booked, processed, and written up for obstruction. If you play nice, maybe the judge lets you off with a fine. But if you keep running that mouth of yours, we can add resisting arrest. Maybe even assaulting an officer. Lena forced herself to remain calm. Assault? I didn't touch either of you. That's the beauty of it, Grant said, grinning. It's our word against yours. The car rumbled over potholes as they drove deeper into the city, toward the precinct. The looming gray building came into view, its barred windows and stone facade unwelcoming. Lena exhaled slowly. This was going to be bad. The moment they arrived, Simmons and Grant led her through the back entrance, bypassing the main lobby. The hallway was dimly lit, walls lined with old case files and coffee-stained desks. The air smelled of ink, sweat, and something metallic. A desk sergeant, a graying man with tired eyes, barely glanced at her as they pushed her forward. Charges, he asked, scribbling on a form. Obstruction resisting, Simmons said easily. Lena's lips parted. That's a lie. Grant yanked her arm. You were saying? She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay silent. Not here. Not yet. The sergeant barely acknowledged the exchange. He just nodded, handing Simmons a clipboard. Cell 3's open. They led her down another hallway. More officers watched from their desks, some with mild curiosity, others with outright disinterest. To them, this was routine. Another arrest. Another formality. But to Lena, this was the beginning of war. Simmons uncuffed her wrists just long enough to shove her into the cell, a small, cold space lined with a metal bench. Make yourself at home, Grant said, locking the door. Lena sat on the bench, rubbing her sore wrists. Her heart pounded, but she willed herself to stay in control. They thought they had her trapped. They thought she was powerless, but they had no idea who she really was. Hours passed. No call. No lawyer. No explanations. Lena stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster. She forced herself to breathe, to think. She wasn't just fighting two bad cops. She was fighting an entire system designed to protect them. Eventually, the cell door creaked open. On your feet, Simmons barked. Lena rose, keeping her expression blank as they led her into a small interrogation room. The walls were bare except for a camera mounted in the corner, its red light blinking steadily. Grant tossed a piece of paper onto the table. "Sign it." Lena glanced down. It was a pre-written statement. It read, "I, Lena Carter, acknowledge that I became aggressive during my lawful traffic stop, refused to follow orders, and attempted to interfere with an official police investigation. I understand that my actions constituted obstruction of justice, and that resisting arrest was a violation of a law." Lena let out a slow breath. "You've got to be kidding me." Simmons leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "It's simple. Sign it, and we cut you loose with a fine. You get to go home tonight." Lena looked up at them. "And if I don't?" Grant's smirk widened. "Then the DA adds assault to your charges. You spend the night in holding. Maybe longer." Lena scoffed. "You're bluffing. There's video evidence. People recorded." Simmons pushed a folder toward her. "Not the full video." Lena's stomach sank. She opened the folder. Inside were doctored screenshots from the traffic stop. Frames where her expression was tense, where her hand were raised, but taken out of context, they made it look like she was aggressive. Someone had already cut and twisted the footage. Lena clenched her fists. They had done this before. She met Grant's eyes. "And let me guess, your body cams were off." Grant chuckled. "Malfunctioning. Unfortunate, huh?" Simmons nodded toward the paper. "Sign it, Carter." Lena's hands curled into fists, nails digging into her palms. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to tear the document in half, to fight back. But she forced herself to think. If she signed, she'd be free, but admitting guilt would destroy any legal standing she had. If she refused, she'd be stuck in the system at their mercy. She looked between them, calculated, analyzed, weighed her options. Then, slowly, she pushed the paper back across the table. "I'm not signing a damn thing." For the first time, Simmons' smirk faltered. Grant's jaw tightened. Lena straightened her spine, staring them down. "You think you can scare me into submission? You're going to have to do better than that." The silence stretched. The tension thickened. Then Simmons sighed, rubbing his temples. "Fine," he muttered. "Have it your way." He grabbed the paper, crumpling it in his fist. "Enjoy your stay in holding." They turned and walked out, slamming the door behind them. Lena exhaled slowly. They thought they had won. They had no idea they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. Lena Carter sat on the cold, hard bench of the holding cell, staring at the cinder block walls. Sleep had been a fleeting, impossible thing. Every time she closed her eyes, the voices of Officers Simmons and Grant echoed in her mind. "Sign it, Carter. It's our word against yours. You're just another nobody who doesn't know her place." She wasn't naive. She knew the system. She knew how deep the rot went. But knowing it and feeling it firsthand were two very different things. A guard stomped down the hall, keys rattling. He stopped in front of her cell and smacked the bars. "Carter, you're up." Lena took a deep breath and rose to her feet. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. They paraded her through the precinct like she was a spectacle. Other officers glanced up from their desks as she passed, some with amusement, others with thinly veiled indifference. When they reached the courthouse, she was met by her assigned defense attorney, a wiry, exhausted-looking public defender named David Langley. He barely looked at her as he spoke. "They're offering a plea deal," he said flatly, flipping through a thin folder. "Drop the resisting charge if you plead guilty to obstruction. Probation, fine, no jail time." Lena let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You think I'm taking a deal for something I didn't do?" Langley sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I don't know what happened back there, but this judge, he's not exactly open-minded. If we go in there fighting, it's just going to get worse." Lena narrowed her eyes. "You mean he sides with cops no matter what?" Langley gave her a tired look. "I mean, you're not walking out of there with a fair trial." Lena exhaled, steadying herself. "No plea. No surrender." "Then let's get this over with," she muttered. The courtroom was a battlefield disguised as a hall of justice. At the front sat Judge Alan Blake, a gray-haired, thick-jowled man who had been on the bench long enough to perfect the art of pretending to be impartial, while handing down lopsided rulings. Seated at the prosecution's table was Caroline Whitaker, a sharp-featured district attorney with a reputation for defending cops at all costs. She wore a smirk like she'd already won, and behind her, sitting stiffly in uniform, were Simmons and Grant. Their smug expressions made Lena's stomach churn. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Blake adjusted his glasses as he peered at Lena. "State the charges." Whitaker rose, smooth and polished. "Your Honor, the defendant, Lena Carter, is charged with obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct. The prosecution will present clear evidence that the defendant refused lawful commands and escalated the situation with her combative behavior." Lena's hands curled into fists. "Lies." Langley stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, my client denies these charges. There's video evidence that contradicts the officer's reports," Whitaker scoffed. "A shaky cell phone clip from a biased bystander? That's hardly reliable." Langley straightened. "We believe it's enough to warrant doubt at the very least." Judge Blake sighed, barely masking his impatience. "Let's proceed with the hearing. Ms. Whitaker, your first witness." Whitaker smiled. "The prosecution calls Officer Troy Simmons to the stand." Simmons took the stand, adjusting his uniform as he settled into a seat. "Officer Simmons," Whitaker began, "can you describe the events of the traffic stop in question?" "Yes, ma'am," Simmons said smoothly. "We observed the defendant driving erratically, so we initiated a stop. When we approached, she became immediately hostile, demanding explanations, raising her voice." "Objection," Langley cut in. "There's no evidence that she raised her voice." Judge Blake waved a dismissive hand. "I'll allow it. Continue, officer." Lena clenched her teeth. "Of course." Simmons nodded solemnly. "As we attempted to conduct our investigation, Ms. Carter refused to step out of the vehicle, creating a dangerous situation. When we finally got her out, she pulled away and made aggressive movements." Lena felt rage boil in her chest. "That was a lie. A complete lie." Whitaker turned toward the jury. "So, in your professional opinion, did the defendant pose a threat?" Simmons nodded. "Absolutely." "Thank you, officer. No further questions." Langley stood, adjusting his tie. "Officer Simmons, did Ms. Carter ever make physical contact with either you or your partner?" Simmons hesitated, just a fraction of a second. "She resisted." Langley took a step forward. "That's not what I asked. Did she touch you?" Simmons' jaw clenched. "No, but resistance doesn't require physical contact." Langley nodded. "So you're saying she was aggressive, despite remaining entirely nonviolent?" Whitaker objected, claiming Langley was twisting words. Judge Blake agreed. And just like that, Simmons walked off the stand without a scratch. Next came Grant. His story was identical. Same false accusations. Same over-exaggerated claims. Same smug certainty that no one would challenge him. Lena's blood boiled. Langley called the bystander who had filmed the encounter, Keisha Brown. Keisha took the stand, nerves evident in the way her fingers tapped against her lap. "Ms. Brown, what did you witness that day?" Langley asked. Keisha cleared her throat. "I saw the officers pull Ms. Carter out of her car. She wasn't fighting them. She just kept asking why they were arresting her. She didn't yell or get violent." Langley nodded. "Did you hear the officers make any comments?" Keisha hesitated. "Yeah. One of them called her one of those mouthy types." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Whitaker, unfazed, stood for cross-examination. "Ms. Brown, how close were you to the scene?" "Across the street. So you couldn't hear everything, correct?" Keisha hesitated. "Not every word, no." Whitaker pounced. "Then how can you be sure Ms. Carter didn't resist at some point before you started filming?" Keisha frowned. "Because I saw her. She was calm." Whitaker smirked. "But you admit you don't have the full story." Judge Blake, predictably, sided with Whitaker. Lena wanted to scream. After a short recess, Judge Blake returned. His gaze was cold. "The evidence presented is inconclusive. However, given the officer's accounts and Ms. Carter's refusal to comply, I find sufficient cause to proceed with formal charges." Lena's heart pounded. "You will be held on bail for $55,000 until trial." A sickening hush fell over the room. Simmons and Grant smirked. Whitaker smoothed her blazer with satisfaction. And Lena sat there, gripping the edge of the defense table so tightly her knuckles turned white. This wasn't justice. This was a goddamn execution. Lena Carter had always known that justice wasn't blind. It wasn't even impartial. It had favorites, it had enemies, and more often than not, it protected the wrong people. But standing in that courtroom, hearing Judge Alan Blake set her bail at a ludicrous $55,000 for a nonviolent charge, watching Simmons and Grant exchange smug glances at the prosecution's table, it became painfully, infuriatingly clear. This wasn't just bias. This was a rigged game, and Lena was supposed to lose. As the courtroom emptied, Lena turned to her attorney, David Langley. "Appeal the bail," she demanded. Langley hesitated. "I can try, but Blake rarely. I don't care," she snapped. "We're not rolling over for this." Langley sighed but nodded. "I'll file a motion." Lena barely had time to breathe before Caroline Whitaker approached. "Lena," the prosecutor said smoothly, as if they were old acquaintances. "Can I call you Lena?" Lena turned, arms crossed. "Not if you want to keep your teeth." Whitaker smiled like she hadn't heard her. "Listen, I know this has been a tough day for you." Lena narrowed her eyes. "Oh, spare me. You're about to offer me another bullshit plea deal, aren't you?" Whitaker gave a small chuckle. "You catch on fast. Look, take the deal. Plead guilty to obstruction, pay a fine, and this all goes away." Lena's blood boiled. "If I was a white woman in a suit, we wouldn't even be having this conversation." Whitaker's smile never wavered. "If you were a white woman in a suit, you wouldn't have made this so difficult for yourself." Lena almost lunged at her, but she didn't. She just smiled. "Tell Simmons and Grant they're going to regret this." Whitaker's eyes glinted. "Regret what, Lena? You still think you can win?" She leaned in slightly. "You're not special. You're just another statistic waiting to happen." Lena stared at her for a long moment. Then, softly, she said, "We'll see about that." They led her back to the cage. Because that's what it was, a cage disguised as a holding cell, built to remind people like her exactly where they stood in the food chain. As Lena sat down on the cold metal bench, her mind spun. Whitaker wasn't just confident, she was smug, which meant she wasn't just winning in the courtroom. She controlled more than that. Lena needed to know how deep the corruption ran before she could fight back. Hours passed before Langley returned, looking grim. "What?" Lena asked. Langley hesitated, then sighed, sliding a folder onto the table. Lena opened it, and rage consumed her. Inside were photos from the traffic stop, but they weren't real. One showed her with an aggressive expression, mid-sentence, as if she was yelling. Another, carefully cropped, made it seem like she was pulling away from the officers. The worst one? A frame from a split-second moment where Simmons was grabbing her wrist, but edited to look like she was trying to hit him. She slammed the folder shut. "These are doctored." Langley exhaled. "I know, but the court won't care. The DA is going to present them as evidence in your trial." Lena clenched her fists. "And you're telling me no one is going to challenge this?" Langley's silence was her answer. Her pulse pounded in her ears. They were setting her up, fully, completely. And the worst part? This had been done to countless others before her. Later that night, Lena was awoken by whispers. Two women sat on the opposite bench, murmuring. One was young, barely out of her teens. The other looked exhausted, beyond her years. "Who's next?" the younger one muttered. "Whoever they decide," the older one replied bitterly. Lena shifted. "What do you mean?" The older woman glanced up. "You new here?" Lena nodded. The woman sighed. "It's a cycle. They pick someone up, rough him up a little, slap on fake charges. Maybe they take a deal. Maybe they fight and lose. Either way, the cops win." Lena's blood ran cold. "Who?" she asked. "Which cops?" The older woman scoffed. "Blake, Simmons, Grant." Whitaker. They've been running this scam for years. Lena's stomach churned. This wasn't just about her. This was a system, a machine, and she was its latest victim. By morning, Lena had made her choice. She wasn't just going to fight this case. She was going to tear this whole corrupt network apart. But first, she needed proof. And she knew exactly where to start. She had one phone call, and she was about to use it to burn the whole place down. Lena Carter had spent years studying the law, believing in its principles, trusting that evidence mattered, that truth had weight. But sitting in that courtroom, watching the prosecution lay out a fabricated version of reality, she realized something chilling. It wasn't about truth. It was about control. The system didn't need to prove she was guilty. It only needed to make it impossible for her to prove she wasn't. Caroline Whitaker stood at the front of the courtroom, her crisp navy suit unwrinkled, her expression calm and composed. She had perfected the art of looking reasonable while spitting out calculated lies. "The prosecution presents photographic evidence," Whitaker announced, handing a folder to Judge Alan Blake. These images, taken from the scene, clearly depict the defendant in a combative stance, resisting lawful orders from officers Simmons and Grant. Judge Blake flipped through the images with a mild nod before passing them to the defense table. Lena's lawyer, Langley, didn't even look surprised anymore. He handed them to Lena without a word. Lena's stomach turned as she studied the photos. They were worse than she expected. The images had been carefully selected. Moments where her face was tense, where her arm was mid-motion, deliberately cropped and angled to suggest aggression. One picture showed her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open, as if she were shouting. She knew she hadn't shouted. She had barely raised her voice. But to anyone looking at this out of context, she looked hostile. Whitaker's voice was smooth, almost soothing. "As you can see, Your Honor, the defendant was clearly escalating the situation. This was not a case of wrongful arrest. This was an officer ensuring public safety." Public safety. Lena nearly laughed. Langley stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, the defense would like to present video evidence contradicting the prosecution's claims." Whitaker folded her arms. "Ah yes, the shaky cell phone clip." Langley ignored her and gestured to the bailiff, who queued up the footage on a small courtroom monitor. The video began. It was short, too short. It showed Lena standing beside her car, hands visible. The officers were speaking to her, but the audio was faint. Then, suddenly, the clip cut off. Lena's blood ran cold. She turned to Langley. "This isn't the full video." Langley looked equally confused. "I don't understand." Whitaker sighed dramatically. "Your Honor, this footage was provided by a bystander. There's no proof it captures the entire incident. And even if it did, it doesn't show what happened before the officers had to detain Ms. Carter." Langley clenched his jaw. "Your Honor, we know that a longer version of this video exists, but do you have it?" Blake interrupted. Langley hesitated. Whitaker smirked. "No further questions, Your Honor." Lena's hands curled into fists. Someone had tampered with the footage. The next dagger came in the form of Detective Ryan Costas, a so-called expert witness from Internal Affairs. Lena had never met this man before, but the moment he took the stand, she knew what he was there for. He wasn't here to investigate. He was here to bury her. Whitaker approached the stand. "Detective Costas, you reviewed the case file. In your professional opinion, do the officers' actions align with proper procedure?" Costas adjusted his tie. "Based on my review of the evidence, yes." "Do you believe there was a legitimate reason for the officers to detain Ms. Carter?" "Given her body language and verbal noncompliance, yes." Noncompliance. Lena's head pounded. Asking why she was being detained was now considered noncompliance. Langley stood for cross-examination. "Detective Costas, did you conduct an independent investigation into this incident?" Costas didn't blink. "I reviewed the available evidence." Langley pressed. "Did you personally interview witnesses?" Costas shifted slightly. "I reviewed statements from the officers involved." Lena's stomach turned. He hadn't spoken to any independent witnesses. Only the cops. Langley leaned in. So you're not actually verifying anything, Detective. You're just repeating what the officers told you. Whitaker objected. Blake sustained it. And just like that, Costas was excused. As the hearing dragged on, Lena could feel the walls closing in. Whitaker called Officer Grant back to the stand, where he repeated his same lies, that Lena had been hostile, that she had refused orders, that she created a public disturbance. The judge dismissed every objection Langley raised, allowing the prosecution to paint her as an unstable aggressor. The jury, a mix of indifferent faces and outright hostile ones, watched Lena like she was already convicted. By the time Whitaker sat back down, Lena knew what was coming next. Judge Blake steepled his fingers. "Ms. Carter," he said, "based on the evidence provided, I find it appropriate to formally proceed with this case. You will remain out on bail until trial." Lena's jaw tightened. Trial. A full trial. They weren't just trying to find her. They were trying to destroy her. As Lena left the courtroom, something happened. A woman, a stranger, brushed past her, slipping something into her hand. A USB drive. Lena's breath caught. She turned to see a young woman disappearing into the crowd. Who was she? And what was on this drive? Lena Carter walked out of the courthouse, gripping the USB drive like it was the only weapon she had left. For hours, the prosecution had twisted reality, erasing pieces of her truth with each carefully manipulated lie. Now, she held something unknown, a fragment of hope. But the real question was, did it contain anything that could actually save her? She had no time to waste. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Lena barely waited for her lawyer before ducking into a cafe down the street, hands shaking as she plugged the USB into her laptop. A single video file. No label, no timestamp, just a grainy thumbnail of her own face. She clicked play, and everything changed. The video started seconds before Simmons and Grant had yanked her from the car. This was the full recording. It showed Lena's voice steady, calm, never yelling. Simmons grabbing her wrist first, initiating force without cause. Grant smirking as he whispered something inaudible before slamming her against the car. The exact moment she asked why she was being searched, and the officers ignoring her rights. Then came the part the court never saw. Grant turned toward the squad car, adjusting his radio. His lips moved, and for the first time, the audio was clear. "Gotta make this one stick," he muttered. "DA's watching." Lena's breath caught. That sentence alone could blow the case apart. The district attorney's office had been involved before she was even booked, which meant this wasn't just about two corrupt cops. The whole damn system was in on it. Lena slammed the laptop shut, heart hammering. She needed to get this into the right hands. Marcus Reed, her old law school friend, a federal prosecutor, someone she could trust. She pulled out her phone, dialing his number. 3 rings. Then Lena. She exhaled sharply. "Marcus, I need your help." Silence. Then wariness. "What happened?" Lena hesitated. Then simply, "I have something that can take down the entire DA's office." Lena agreed to meet Marcus in an hour, but as she stepped back onto the street, a cold feeling crept over her. She was being watched. Not openly, not obviously, but she knew the signs. Across the street, a black sedan sat idling too long. At the corner, a man in a gray suit stood still, talking into a phone, eyes flicking toward her just a little too often. Someone knew. She had the footage, and they weren't going to let her keep it. She needed a plan, fast. Instead of heading straight to meet Marcus, she took a detour, switched subway lines twice, walked into a department store, and ducked through the emergency exit. By the time she finally arrived at their meeting spot, a dimly lit bar on the Lower East Side, she was convinced she'd shaken whoever was tailing her. Marcus was already at a back booth, brow furrowed in concern. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Tell me everything," he said. Lena pulled out the USB and slid it across the table. Marcus plugged it into his tablet, watching in silence. When the clip ended, he let out a low whistle. "Holy shit," he muttered. "They're done. This is conspiracy-level corruption." Lena nodded. "But we need to move fast." If they realize I have this, before she could finish, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A familiar voice crackled through the line. Ms. Carter, you should have taken the deal. Whitaker. Lena's blood ran cold. I hope you haven't done anything reckless, Whitaker continued smoothly. Because, if you have, things might get very difficult for you. A pause. And for anyone helping you. Lena's grip on the phone tightened. Are you threatening me? Whitaker chuckled. Oh, Lena, I don't make threats. I make promises. Then the line went dead. Lena cursed under her breath. Marcus leaned forward. What? She turned to him, heart pounding. They know. This wasn't just a fight for her freedom anymore. This was war. She had one night to get this footage somewhere safe, before the system crushed her completely. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. We leak it. Tonight. Marcus nodded, expression grim. But before they could move, a black SUV pulled up outside the bar. Men stepped out. And then, the power cut out. Darkness swallowed the bar. For a split second, there was nothing. No voices, no footsteps, just the suffocating silence of a city that never truly slept. Then crash. A chair scraped violently against the floor. Someone moved fast. Too fast. Lena Carter's instincts screamed run. Get down. Marcus hissed. A flashlight beam cut through the blackness. Shadows shifted. Heavy boots pounded against the floor. They weren't cops. Cops didn't move like this. These were hunters. And she was the prey. Lena shoved the USB into her pocket and dropped low, heart hammering. Marcus grabbed her wrist. We go out the back. Now. They moved fast, weaving through the overturned chairs and tables, slipping behind the bar as the men fanned out across the room. A voice, sharp, controlled, cut through the darkness. Ms. Carter, let's not make this difficult. Whitaker. Lena's blood ran cold. She was here, personally. Marcus yanked open the emergency exit, and they burst into the alleyway. Cold night air hit Lena's face as she stumbled forward. But there was no time to breathe. Engines roared to life. A black SUV skidded around the corner, headlights blazing. Lena grabbed Marcus, yanking him behind a dumpster just as the vehicle screeched. To a stop. Men in suits poured out. More than she expected. Too many. Lena's mind raced. They weren't here to arrest her. They were here to erase her. Plan. Marcus muttered. Lena exhaled sharply. Split up. Meet at the safe house. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. Stay alive, Carter, he said, before bolting toward the other end of the alley. Lena took off in the opposite direction. Gunmetal footsteps thundered behind her. She sprinted past dumpsters, vaulted over a low fence, her lungs burning. But they were gaining. A side street loomed ahead, empty, quiet. Too quiet. A trap. She spun on instinct, cutting through a convenience store instead. Shocked customers gasped as she knocked over a display, pushing through the back door and into another alley. Her heart pounded. The USB felt like it was on fire in her pocket. She had to get this to the right people. But first, she had to survive the night. By the time Lena reached the safe house, she was exhausted. A rundown apartment on the outskirts of Brooklyn. Small. Forgettable. Marcus was already inside, pacing. You made it, he breathed. Barely. She pulled out the USB. We need to leak this now. Before they. The door burst open. Lena's heart stopped. Detective Ryan Costas. The Internal Affairs expert witness. Gun raised. She barely had time to react before he fired. Marcus lunged, slamming into her. The bullet shattered a lamp behind them. Lena hit the floor, ears ringing. Marcus groaned. He was hit. This wasn't just corruption anymore. It was war. Costas advanced, gun still raised. You should have taken the deal, Carter. Lena's breath came in short gasps. You think killing me will fix this? She spat. Costas smirked. No, but it'll stop you from talking. He took another step, and then his phone buzzed. He hesitated, checked the screen, and his face changed. Lena took the chance. She grabbed the fallen lamp and swung. Crack. The glass shattered across Costas' face. He cursed, stumbling back, gun dropping from his grip. Lena kicked it across the room. Marcus groaned from the floor. "Go," he gasped. "Finish this." Lena grabbed the USB, ignoring the burn in her muscles, the ache in her ribs. It was time to end this. She had one shot, one chance to put this in front of the world before they silenced her for good. She grabbed Marcus' laptop, plugged in the USB, and typed fast. The DOJ, the media, the Civil Rights Division. She uploaded everything. The video, the photos, the proof of evidence tampering. Then she hit send. The files exploded onto the internet. She barely had time to exhale before a second gunshot rang out. Marcus screamed. Lena turned. Costas, back on his feet, gun raised again. But before he could pull the trigger, the entire building shook. Flashing red and blue lights filled the windows. Sirens. Dozens of them. The cavalry had arrived. The sirens were deafening. Red and blue lights flooded the apartment, flashing against shattered glass and bullet-riddled walls. Heavy boots pounded up the stairs, voices shouting commands. Lena Carter lay on the ground, her chest heaving, her ears still ringing from the gunshot that nearly ended everything. Across the room, Detective Ryan Costas had finally stopped moving. His gun was on the floor. His nose was broken, blood dripping onto his suit. His career was over, and he knew it. Marcus groaned beside her, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He was alive, but barely. The door burst open. Uniformed officers stormed in, weapons drawn. And, at the front of the pack, Detective Brian Costello. Internal Affairs. And, for once, not one of the bad guys. Costello's sharp eyes flicked between Lena, Marcus, and Costas. He didn't need to ask what happened. The evidence was all over the damn room. "Get him up," he barked. Two officers seized Costas, yanking him to his feet. He didn't fight, didn't resist, didn't even look surprised. Just let out a humorless chuckle. "You think this changes anything?" Costas sneered. Lena pushed herself upright. "You're done," she rasped. "And so is Whitaker." Costas laughed, actually laughed. "Lady," he said, shaking his head, "Whitaker isn't the real power here. You're still 3 steps behind." Lena's blood ran cold. There was someone bigger, someone above Whitaker. But before she could press him, Costello spoke. "We'll deal with that later," he said. "Right now we're bringing him in." He turned to Lena, his gaze unreadable. "You too, Carter." Lena's body tensed. "What?" Costello's expression was almost apologetic. "You still have pending charges." Lena's pulse spiked. "No, not now. Not after everything." "You've seen the evidence," she snapped. "You know it was all fabricated." Costello nodded. "Yeah, but we have to do this by the book." Lena's hands curled into fists. The book. The same damn book that let Simmons and Grant frame her. That let Whitaker bury people like her. That let Costas put a bullet in Marcus and almost walk away. Marcus groaned from the floor. Lena shook her head. "Not today," she said. And then, before Costello could react, she pulled out her phone. Every journalist, every news outlet, every damn person who cared about justice had been waiting for an update. Lena gave them one. She hit go live. Her face appeared on screen, bloodied but defiant. "This is Lena Carter," she said, her voice unwavering. "And I just exposed one of the biggest corruption scandals in this city's history." Costello's eyes widened. Lena turned the camera toward Costas. "This man tried to kill me tonight. The same way Officers Simmons and Grant tried to bury me in false charges. The same way District Attorney Caroline Whitaker helped cover it all up." Then she turned the phone on Costello. "And now," she said, "Internal Affairs wants to arrest me instead of protecting me." Costello stiffened. His radio crackled to life. Sir," a voice said urgently. "We got a situation." Costello raised a hand, pressing his earpiece. "What situation?" The voice hesitated. "Then, the DA's office is on fire." 15 minutes later, Lena was sitting in the back of an ambulance, watching the empire collapse. The DOJ had intervened. The Civil Rights Division had launched a full investigation. The media was eating this up. The footage from the USB had gone viral within minutes. It was everywhere, and Caroline Whitaker was nowhere to be found. News vans swarmed the courthouse. Protesters had gathered, chanting her name, chanting for justice. And then, a breaking news alert flashed across the screen. Breaking. District Attorney Caroline Whitaker resigns amid corruption allegations. Lena let out a slow, shaky breath. She had won, but at what cost? She looked down at Marcus, unconscious on the stretcher beside her. This wasn't over. Not yet. Not until everyone responsible paid. And she was going to make damn sure they did. The city was burning, not with flames, but with truth. The fall of District Attorney Caroline Whitaker had sent shockwaves through every level of power. Protesters filled the streets. News anchors dissected every frame of the leaked video. The system was unraveling. But Lena Carter knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Because if Whitaker had been a puppet, then somewhere out there, the real puppet master was still pulling the strings. And Lena was going to find them, no matter what it took. She's gone. Marcus Reed's voice was hoarse from pain, but his eyes were sharp as he lay on the hospital bed. His shoulder was bandaged, his skin pale, but he was still fighting. Lena sat beside him, gripping her phone. Whitaker didn't just resign. She disappeared. Marcus exhaled sharply. They're tying up loose ends. Lena nodded, which means we need to move before they come for us next. She had spent the last 12 hours connecting the dots, combing through court records, corruption reports, and old whistleblower cases. And one name kept coming up, a name that made her blood run cold. Judge Alan Blake. Blake had been a fixture in the justice system for over 2 decades. A man who had buried police misconduct cases, dismissed racial profiling complaints, and ensured that every corrupt officer who stood before him walked free. Whitaker had been the enforcer. Blake had been the gatekeeper. But someone else, someone higher, had kept him in place. Lena traced it all back to one final name, a name she hadn't dared to speak out loud yet. She turned to Marcus. I think I know who's really running this. He met her gaze. Who? Lena hesitated. Then she whispered, Police Commissioner William Royce. Royce was a legend in the NYPD, a hardliner, a law and order zealot, a man who had cultivated an image of unwavering integrity. But beneath that image was a network of corruption so deep it had swallowed entire careers. Royce had installed Blake as a judge. Royce had funneled cases through Whitaker. Royce had protected Simmons, Grant, and Costas. And now, Royce wanted Lena dead. Lena had one shot to bring him down. She needed something bigger than just the video. She needed testimony. She needed someone on the inside. And there was only one person who might be desperate enough to flip. Ryan Costas, the detective who had tried to kill her. The detective who was now rotting in a holding cell, abandoned by the system he had once served. It took every ounce of Lena's patience to walk into Rikers Island without wanting to break Costas' jaw. He sat in an interrogation room, wrists cuffed, eyes bruised, a smirk still barely hanging on. Ms. Carter, he drawled. To what do I owe the pleasure? Lena dropped a folder on the table. Your life is over, Costas, but I can offer you a way out. He chuckled. You gonna let me walk? Lena leaned in. You testify against Royce. The smirk vanished. For the first time, Costas looked afraid. You don't know what you're asking, he muttered. Lena smiled coldly. Oh, I know exactly what I'm asking. Costas swallowed hard. If I do this, I'm dead. Lena's voice was ice. You were already dead the second Royce cut you loose. Silence. Costas stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. Within hours, Costas' statement was recorded. Every dirty secret, every backroom deal, every cover-up. Lena and Marcus sent it straight to the Department of Justice, and when the feds moved, they moved fast. Within 24 hours, Judge Blake was taken into custody. Within 48 hours, dozens of officers loyal to Royce were placed under investigation. And then, finally, the arrest warrant was issued for William Royce. But Royce wasn't the type to go down quietly. When the FBI arrived at his estate, he was waiting, gun in hand, press surrounding him. And then he spoke, a speech full of righteous fury, a speech about how the liberal machine was trying to destroy him, how he had protected this city, how Lena Carter was a liar, a criminal, a fraud. But Lena was ready. She had spent years being silenced. She wasn't going to let them silence her again. She stepped in front of the cameras, looked Royce dead in the eye, and said, "You spent your whole career making people like me feel powerless. But you made one mistake, Commissioner. You should have killed me when you had the chance." The moment went viral. Royce was finished. The world was watching. The mighty police commissioner William Royce, once untouchable, once the most feared man in the justice system, was now a fugitive. His name was plastered across every news headline. Corruption scandal explodes in NYPD. Judge, district attorney, and top detectives exposed. Commissioner William Royce. Public enemy number one? Lena Carter had fought too hard, lost too much to let him slip away now. This was the end game. But the question was, how would it end? Royce had vanished. His security detail had been pulled. His home was under surveillance. His bank accounts were frozen. But he wasn't just running, he was buying time. Lena could feel it. "He's not going down quietly," Marcus said. His arm was still in a sling, but his mind was sharp as ever. "He's got dirt on half this city. He's probably making deals right now." Lena nodded. "He knows the system. He knows how to disappear." Marcus exhaled sharply. "We need to find him before someone else does. Because if someone inside the system got to Royce first, he wouldn't face justice. He'd be erased, and the truth would disappear with him." It was Detective Costello who finally gave them the lead they needed. "FBI intercepted a burner phone call," Costello said, sliding a transcript across the table. Lena skimmed it. Royce was trying to arrange passage out of the country. "Destination? Dubai." "Where's he hiding now?" she asked. Costello hesitated. "Then, an old safe house. Abandoned precinct building. Brooklyn waterfront." Lena's stomach turned. She knew that place. It was where NYPD's dirtiest secrets were buried. And now, it was where Royce was waiting. Lena arrived first. No backup. No cameras. Just her and Royce. He was inside the empty precinct, sitting at an old desk, drinking from a glass of whiskey like he wasn't a man with his back against the wall. "Ms. Carter," he said smoothly, swirling the glass. "You look victorious." Lena didn't move. "It's over, Royce." He chuckled. "Is it? You're done." Royce took a slow sip. "Do you know what the real difference is between justice and revenge?" Lena stayed silent. Royce leaned forward. "Justice follows the rules. Revenge doesn't." He set the glass down. "Which one are you here for?" Lena's fingers twitched. Justice or revenge? She had lost everything because of this man. She had been humiliated, beaten, hunted. Marcus had been shot. Innocent people had suffered. For years under his rule. And now he just sat there drinking whiskey like it was just another night. It wasn't fair. It wasn't. But that's what made her different from him. She exhaled slowly. "I'm here for justice." Royce smirked. "Then you've already lost." Then he reached into his desk drawer. Lena's gun was up before he could blink. "Don't," she said coldly. Royce smirked. "Are you going to shoot me, Ms. Carter?" Lena didn't move. "I don't need to." Behind her, sirens wailed. FBI, DOJ, Internal Affairs. They had arrived. Royce's face finally fell. Lena let out a breath. "It's over," she said, and this time it was. The trial was national news. Royce was charged with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, racketeering, and aiding and abetting violent crimes. He tried to cut a deal, but there were no deals left. His loyal officers turned on him to save themselves. Simmons and Grant? Guilty. Whitaker? Sentenced. Blake? Disgraced and disbarred. The system had cracked. And this time, the right people paid the price. Lena stood on the courthouse steps, facing a swarm of reporters. "Ms. Carter," one shouted. "Now that this is over, what's next?" Lena paused. She had spent so long fighting that she had never considered what came after. But now, she looked at the crowd, the people still fighting. The battle wasn't over. She gave a small, tired smile. "Now," she said, "now we rebuild." And with that she walked away. The end. What do you think? Did Lena get the justice she fought for? Should those in power face harsher consequences when they abuse the system? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. And don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. If you believe in standing up to corruption, hit like, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more stories where the powerful are held accountable.